In that last module, we talked about conditional statements, and we said a conditional statement is a statement that relates two statements together, component statements, in terms of their truth value. And specifically, a conditional statement asserts that if an antecedent is true, if this condition is met, then the consequent is true. That statement will also be true. Now let's look at the two fallacies discussed in the chapter having to do with conditionals. These are both formal fallacies. So the first conditional fallacy that the author discusses is called affirming the consequent. Affirming the consequent occurs when one infers the truth of the antecedent, the if clause of a conditional, based upon the truth of the consequent, the then clause of a conditional. So remember, conditionals have that directionality. The directionality is all about truth. If the antecedent is true, when the antecedent is true, then the consequent is true. Then this other statement is true. Fallacy of affirming the consequent doesn't follow that directionality. In the fallacy of affirming the consequent, you infer the truth of the antecedent. You go to the if clause, infer that's true on the basis of the then clause, the consequent clause. So for example, here's an instance of affirming the consequent. If Wallace affirms the consequent, then Wallace commits a formal fallacy. That conditional statement, that first premise, is true. That's the relationship. If I affirm the consequent, it's an instance of a formal fallacy, so I commit a formal fallacy. The second premise could also be true. Wallace commits a formal fallacy, right? From which I infer Wallace affirms the consequent. However, that isn't guaranteed to be true given the truth of those two premises. So we have this argument: conditional statement, consequent, conclusion, antecedent. But the antecedent's truth doesn't follow from the conditional statement being true and the consequent being true. So I can commit a formal fallacy, making that second premise true. That first premise is going to be true because that's what it means to affirm the consequent. You commit a formal fallacy. But I can make that second premise true without committing the fallacy of affirming the consequent. For example, I could commit the fallacy of denying the antecedent, the next fallacy that we'll look at. And if I did that, then that first premise is true. The second premise is true. I did commit a formal fallacy. But that third premise is not true. What about that fallacy of denying the antecedent? Denying the antecedent occurs when one infers the falsity of the consequent, the then clause of a conditional, based upon the falsity of the antecedent, the if clause of a conditional. Remember, conditionals have a directionality: if, antecedent, then consequent. And the directionality is all about the truth of those component statements. If the antecedent is true, if you satisfy this condition, then the consequent is true. So it's all about truth. It's all about antecedent making the consequent or being associated with the truth of the consequent. Fallacy of denying the antecedent gets rid of the truth part of that and then commits a formal fallacy. So if Wallace affirms the consequent, then Wallace commits a formal fallacy. That's a true conditional statement. Affirming the consequent is a way of committing a formal fallacy. If the antecedent is true, the consequent will also be true. Now, second premise, Wallace does not affirm the consequent. The antecedent is false. The conditional makes no guarantees about the consequent now. But the person who commits the fallacy of denying the antecedent makes an inference about the consequent, namely that the consequent is false or its denial is true. Wallace does not commit a formal fallacy. Again, we can see that this isn't a good argument because it's possible for that first conditional statement to be true. In fact, it's always going to be true. If you affirm the consequent, you commit a formal fallacy. The second premise can also be true. I do not affirm the consequent. That's true because, well, because I committed the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Therefore, I did not commit a formal fallacy. Well, denying the antecedent is a formal fallacy, so the premises are true, the conclusion is false.